I'm Sarah Mitchell, and 6 months ago I watched my brother David's face crumble when he discovered that the $2.8 million trust fund he'd been scheming to steal had vanished from every account he thought he could access. What he didn't know was that I'd moved every penny offshore 3 weeks before his elaborate heist, and the look of pure devastation when he realized he'd destroyed our family for absolutely nothing still gives me chills. The best part, he'd already spent money he didn't have on a lifestyle meant to impress investors in his fake green energy startup, and now the FBI was knocking on his door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains in Cherry Hills Village, our family looked like the American dream wrapped in a perfect suburban package. Dad, Robert Mitchell, carried himself with the rigid posture of a career military officer, even 15 years after retirement. Mom, Linda, had built a successful real estate empire selling luxury homes to Denver's elite, her Mercedes always pristine in our circular driveway. Our sprawling ranch house sat on 3 acres of meticulously landscaped property, complete with a pool, tennis court, and a 4-car garage that housed Dad's vintage Corvette collection. David and I grew up with every advantage money could buy. Private schools, ski lessons at Vail, summer camps in Switzerland, and college tuition that never required a single student loan. But beneath the surface of our privileged existence, a toxic dynamic had been brewing since childhood, one that would eventually lead to the complete destruction of our family as we knew it. The foundation of our dysfunction traced back to a tragedy that occurred when I was just 2 years old. David, then 5, had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that required extensive medical treatment and kept him hospitalized for months. During this terrifying period, our parents poured every ounce of their attention and emotional energy into ensuring his survival and recovery. The experience bonded them to David in a way that created an unshakable belief that he needed extra protection, extra consideration, and extra forgiveness for any transgression. By the time David's health stabilized, the pattern was set. Our parents had developed what they called David's special circumstances, a phrase that would echo through our household for the next 2 decades. When David struggled in school, it was because of his early health trauma. When he lied about breaking Mom's antique vase, it was because he feared disappointing people who had already been through so much worry over him. When he stole $20 from Dad's wallet at age 12, it was explained as a cry for attention from a child who still felt fragile from his medical ordeal. Meanwhile, I learned to be the easy child. The one who didn't create problems, didn't need extra attention, and certainly didn't require the emotional energy that was perpetually reserved for David's latest crisis. I excelled in school, not because anyone pressured me to, but because academic achievement was the only way I could carve out positive attention in a household where David's needs always came first. While he struggled through remedial math, I was accepted into the gifted program. While he barely graduated high school, I earned a full scholarship to the University of Colorado's business program. The irony wasn't lost on me that my academic success, which should have been celebrated, often felt like an additional burden. Every achievement seemed to highlight David's failures, which only intensified our parents' protective instincts toward him. When I made the dean's list, Dad would quickly change the subject to David's improvement in his community college courses. When I landed my first internship at a prestigious Denver investment firm, Mom would redirect the conversation to David's progress in finding any job at all. David seemed to intuitively understand the power dynamic at play. He learned early that his struggles, real or manufactured, could command immediate attention and resources. Throughout high school, he perfected the art of the crisis that required family intervention just when I was experiencing success. The week I was accepted to college, David was caught selling marijuana on school grounds. The day I graduated summa cum laude, David was arrested for drunk driving and needed Dad to hire an expensive attorney. Each incident followed the same script. David would express remorse, promise to do better, and explain how his latest poor decision stemmed from feeling overlooked or pressured by my achievements. Our parents would rally around him with counseling, second chances, and financial support while quietly asking me to be understanding about the attention he needed during this difficult time. By the time I entered my 20s, I had become expert at reading the warning signs of David's manufactured emergencies. They always coincided with moments when I was gaining independence, or recognition that might shift family focus away from him. When I got engaged to my college boyfriend, David suddenly developed a gambling problem that required family intervention. When I received a promotion to senior analyst at Denver Financial Group, David decided to start his first business venture and needed a significant loan from our parents. The business ventures became David's new specialty. Over a 5-year period, he launched and failed at 6 different enterprises. There was the food truck that never acquired proper permits, the app development company that produced no actual apps, the import business that involved no actual imports, and the cryptocurrency consulting firm that operated during crypto's worst market crash. Each failure was accompanied by elaborate explanations about market conditions, unreliable partners, or economic factors beyond his control. Our parents funded each venture with a combination of direct loans and co-signed credit lines, convinced that David just needed the right opportunity to find his footing. The pattern became predictable. David would present a business plan, filled with industry buzzwords and optimistic projections. Our parents would provide initial funding, the venture would consume more money than projected, and eventually the whole enterprise would collapse under the weight of David's poor management and questionable decision-making. What made these failures particularly galling was David's ability to frame each setback as a learning experience that brought him closer to eventual success. He had developed an impressive vocabulary of entrepreneurial jargon that made his ventures sound sophisticated to our parents, who wanted desperately to believe their son was finally maturing into a responsible adult. Terms like market validation, scalable solutions, and disruptive innovation peppered his presentations, creating an illusion of competence that masked fundamental business incompetence. During this same period, I was building a solid career in financial analysis and developing expertise in international investment strategies. My work involved analyzing global markets, understanding offshore banking regulations, and helping high-net-worth clients protect and grow their assets across international boundaries. The irony that
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Was becoming an expert in the very strategies that would eventually protect our family's wealth from David's schemes was not lost on me, though at the time I had no idea how relevant this knowledge would become. My personal life had also stabilized in ways that seemed to irritate David profoundly. I had been dating Alex Chen, a cybersecurity specialist, for 3 years. Alex worked for a firm that helped businesses protect their digital assets from both external threats and internal fraud, making him uniquely qualified to spot the kind of schemes David was unconsciously preparing to execute. Where David was impulsive and dramatic, Alex was methodical and calm. Where David demanded attention through crisis, Alex earned respect through competence. David's attitude toward Alex ranged from dismissive to openly hostile, particularly when Alex would ask pointed questions about his business ventures. During family dinners, Alex would politely inquire about David's revenue models or customer acquisition strategies, questions that would expose the fundamental flaws in David's planning. David learned to deflect these conversations by claiming Alex didn't understand the entrepreneurial mindset, or by suggesting that too much analysis could kill innovation. The tension between David and Alex came to a head during our parents' 30th wedding anniversary celebration. The family had gathered at our vacation home in Aspen for a long weekend, and David had brought his new girlfriend Vanessa Torres, a social media influencer, whose entire identity seemed to revolve around photographing expensive experiences for her followers. Throughout the weekend, David made increasingly pointed comments about Alex's corporate mindset and suggested that my relationship with someone so risk-averse was holding me back from understanding David's entrepreneurial vision. The breaking point came during dinner on Saturday night, when David announced his latest business idea. Ecotech Solutions, a green energy startup that would revolutionize solar panel installation through proprietary technology and innovative financing models. As he outlined his plan, describing partnerships with major manufacturers and projected revenues in the millions, Alex began asking his usual methodical questions about market research, competitive analysis, and regulatory compliance. David's responses became increasingly evasive and defensive, until he finally exploded, accusing Alex of trying to sabotage his dreams out of jealousy. The accusation was so ridiculous that even our parents looked uncomfortable, but David pressed on, suggesting that Alex felt threatened by entrepreneurs who were willing to take risks for potentially massive rewards. The argument escalated until David stormed out of the dinner, taking Vanessa with him and leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. Later that evening, Alex pulled me aside on the deck overlooking the mountains. The conversation we had that night would prove to be more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. Alex expressed concern not just about David's business acumen, but about his increasingly grandiose claims and apparent detachment from financial reality. He pointed out that David's latest projections seemed designed more to impress potential investors than to reflect any realistic business planning. More troubling, Alex had noticed that David seemed to have developed an intimate knowledge of our family's financial situation, including details about assets that he shouldn't necessarily have access to. During dinner, David had made casual references to the trust fund that our grandfather had established, mentioning specific numbers and distribution schedules that suggested he had been researching our family's wealth more carefully than anyone realized. The trust fund had been established by our paternal grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, a World War II veteran, who had built a construction empire in post-war Denver. Grandpa Tom, as we called him, had been a shrewd businessman who understood that sudden wealth could destroy a family as easily as it could help one. His trust had been structured with careful consideration for the challenges that inherited money could create, particularly for young adults who hadn't yet learned the value of hard work and financial responsibility. Under the terms of the trust, David and I would each receive our full inheritance on our 30th birthdays, with smaller distributions available for specific purposes, like education, home purchases, or business investments. The total value of the trust had grown to approximately $5.6 million, split equally between us. Until we reached the age of distribution, the funds were managed by a professional trustee, James Harrison, a family attorney who had worked with our grandfather for decades. What made Alex's observations particularly unsettling was the realization that David had somehow acquired detailed knowledge about the trust's structure and current value, information that should have been confidential between the trustee and the beneficiaries. David was still 18 months away from his 30th birthday, but he was speaking about the money with the familiarity of someone who had been planning how to access it. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to David's behavior and noticed patterns that I had previously dismissed as typical entrepreneurial enthusiasm. He had begun networking aggressively with high-net-worth individuals in Denver's business community, attending charity galas and investment seminars, where he would introduce himself as the founder of Ecotech Solutions. He had also started posting on social media about his business success, sharing photos of expensive dinners and luxury experiences that seemed inconsistent with someone whose previous ventures had all failed. Most concerning was David's apparent relationship with Tyler Brooks, a smooth-talking businessman from Miami who had recently moved to Boulder and claimed expertise in green energy financing. Tyler had an impressive LinkedIn profile and spoke confidently about renewable energy markets, but something about his presentation felt off to me. His credentials seemed impressive, but were difficult to verify, and his explanations of how he planned to help David scale Ecotech Solutions were heavy on jargon, but light on specifics. When I discreetly researched Tyler's background using the same due diligence tools I employed in my professional work, I discovered several red flags. His previous business ventures had all been short-lived, and there were gaps in his employment history that suggested periods when he wasn't engaged in legitimate business activities. More troubling, I found references to Tyler in several online forums dedicated to exposing investment scams, though nothing that constituted definitive proof of wrongdoing. The pieces of a troubling puzzle were beginning to come together, but I wasn't yet sure what David was planning, or how far he was willing to go to access money that wasn't legally his to take. The trust fund had been structured specifically to prevent impulsive or fraudulent access, with multiple safeguards and verification requirements that should have made unauthorized withdrawals impossible. However, I knew that David had always been resourceful when it came to finding ways around rules and restrictions. His childhood had taught him that persistence, emotional manipulation, and creative storytelling could often override official policies, especially when family members were involved. The question wasn't whether David would try to access the trust fund early, but rather how he planned to circumvent the legal protections that our grandfather had so carefully put in place. What David didn't know was that my expertise in international finance had given me a sophisticated understanding of asset protection strategies that went far beyond anything our grandfather could have imagined when he structured the trust in the 1980s. Modern offshore banking offered opportunities to safeguard assets in ways that were completely legal, but virtually impenetrable to someone attempting unauthorized access. As I watched David's behavior become increasingly erratic and his claims about ecotech solutions become more grandiose, I began to consider the possibility that protecting my inheritance might require more than just relying on the trust's existing safeguards. If David was planning something involving the trust fund, I needed to ensure that my portion of the money was beyond his reach, regardless of whatever scheme he might devise. The decision to take proactive measures wasn't made lightly. Moving money offshore would require careful planning, absolute discretion, and a level of strategic thinking that went against my natural inclination to trust family members and assume good intentions. But David's behavior had moved beyond the realm of typical sibling rivalry or entrepreneurial optimism. His actions suggested someone who was preparing to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The first concrete sign that David was planning something beyond his usual entrepreneurial fantasies came during what should have been a routine family dinner in early March. Mom had invited us all to celebrate her latest real estate award, one of those industry recognition plaques that she collected with the same enthusiasm other people reserved for rare wines. The evening started normally enough, with Dad grilling steaks on the back patio, while Mom bustled around the kitchen, arranging side dishes with the precision of someone who had spent decades hosting business dinners. David arrived 30 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, but he came bearing gifts, which definitely was. He handed Mom an expensive bottle of champagne, the kind that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week, and presented Dad with a box of premium cigars from a specialty shop in downtown Denver. When I raised an eyebrow at his sudden generosity, David just shrugged and said business was picking up faster than he'd expected. Throughout dinner, David dominated the conversation with updates about ecotech solutions that sounded increasingly sophisticated and successful. He talked about preliminary agreements with major solar manufacturers, meetings with potential investors who were excited about his innovative approach to residential energy solutions, and projections that had his company positioned to capture a significant share of Colorado's growing green energy market. His presentation was polished, peppered with industry terminology that sounded impressive to our parents, who nodded along with the kind of pride they'd been waiting decades to feel about David's professional life. What struck me as odd wasn't just the sudden improvement in David's business prospects, but the specificity of his financial projections. He mentioned exact figures for projected revenue streams, detailed timelines for product development, and precise calculations about market penetration rates. This level of detail was completely unlike David's previous ventures, which had always been heavy on enthusiasm and light on actual planning. When I asked him about his market research methodology, he deflected with a comment about proprietary analysis conducted by his business partner Tyler. The conversation took an interesting turn when Dad mentioned his own retirement planning and expressed concern about market volatility affecting their investment portfolio. David immediately perked up and suggested that they might want to consider diversifying into alternative investments that offered better protection against economic uncertainty. He spoke knowledgeably about asset allocation strategies and mentioned several investment vehicles that I recognized as sophisticated financial instruments typically used by high-net-worth individuals. More troubling was David's casual mention of our grandfather's trust fund, which he brought up in the context of discussing long-term financial planning. He suggested that both he and I should be thinking strategically about how to manage our inheritances when they became available, mentioning specific dollar amounts and distribution schedules that demonstrated a thorough understanding of the trust structure. When Mom asked how he knew so much about the trust details, David claimed he'd been doing research to prepare for his eventual inheritance, wanting to be responsible about such a significant financial opportunity. After dinner, David cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping Mom with dishes. He launched into what seemed like a prepared speech about the importance of family members supporting each other's business ventures, particularly when those ventures had the potential to benefit everyone involved. He suggested that once our trust funds became available, we should consider pooling some of our resources to create even bigger investment opportunities that could multiply our wealth exponentially. The pitch felt rehearsed, like David had been practicing this conversation for weeks. He talked about the power of leveraging family capital to access exclusive investment opportunities that weren't available to smaller investors. He mentioned Tyler's connections in the renewable energy sector and suggested that our combined inheritance could position us to become major players in Colorado's green energy transformation. The whole presentation felt like a sales pitch, disguised as brotherly financial planning advice. What made the conversation particularly unsettling was David's assumption that I would be interested in joint investment ventures with him, given his track record of failed businesses and poor financial decisions. He seemed genuinely puzzled when I politely declined his suggestion to meet with Tyler to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. His response was to suggest that maybe I had become too conservative in my thinking, too influenced by traditional investment approaches that missed out on the kind of exponential returns that smart entrepreneurs could achieve. That night, I called Alex and recounted the evening's conversations. Alex's reaction was immediate and concerning. Based on his experience with corporate fraud cases, he recognized several red flags in David's behavior and presentation. The sudden sophistication of David's business knowledge, the specific financial projections, without corresponding market research, and the unprompted discussion of our family's trust fund, all suggested someone who was building toward a larger scheme. Alex's professional experience had taught him that family-based financial fraud often followed predictable patterns. The perpetrator would gradually introduce increasingly sophisticated financial concepts to family members, establishing credibility and trust before proposing investment opportunities that seemed legitimate but were actually designed to redirect family assets for personal use. The fact that David was suddenly displaying expertise in areas where he had previously shown no knowledge or interest was a classic warning sign. More specifically, Alex pointed out that David's newfound interest in our trust fund details suggested he might be planning to access those funds before they became legally available to us. The trust structure included provisions for early distributions under specific circumstances, such as documented business investments or emergency hardships, but these exceptions required extensive documentation and approval from the trustee. If David was planning to pursue early access, he would need to present a compelling case that his business venture qualified for such consideration. The possibility that David might attempt to fraudulently access the trust fund hadn't occurred to me before Alex raised it, but once he planted the idea, I couldn't stop thinking about it. David's pattern of financial irresponsibility, combined with his desperate need to make ecotech solutions appear successful, created motivation for increasingly risky behavior. If he had convinced potential investors that he had access to family capital, he might feel pressured to find ways to access that capital regardless of legal restrictions. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to David's activities and noticed several developments that reinforced Alex's concerns. David had started hosting investor meetings at expensive restaurants and private clubs around Denver, presenting himself as someone with significant financial backing for his green energy ventures. He had also begun posting social media content that suggested a lifestyle incompatible with someone whose previous businesses had all failed, sharing photos from high-end networking events and luxury experiences that required substantial disposable income. Most concerning was David's apparent relationship with financial institutions in the Denver area. Through discreet inquiries with colleagues in the banking industry, I learned that David had been meeting with various banks and credit unions, apparently exploring loan options for business expansion. What made these meetings unusual was that David was claiming to have substantial assets as collateral, assets that wouldn't actually be available to him for another 18 months. The realization that David might be using our trust fund as phantom collateral for business loans prompted me to contact James Harrison, the attorney who served as trustee for our grandfather's estate. Mr. Harrison had been managing our family's legal affairs for over 20 years and had a reputation for careful attention to detail and conservative financial management. When I called to schedule a meeting, I mentioned that I wanted to discuss the trust security protocols and ensure that proper safeguards were in place to prevent unauthorized access. Mr. Harrison's response was immediately concerning. He mentioned that he had recently received several inquiries about the trust structure and distribution schedules, inquiries that he had assumed came from me, but now realized might have originated from David. Someone had contacted his office, claiming to be conducting research on behalf of the beneficiaries, asking detailed questions about early distribution procedures and the documentation required to access funds before the standard distribution age. During our meeting the following week, Mr. Harrison revealed the extent of the problem. David had somehow acquired copies of trust documents that should have been confidential, including financial statements showing the current value of the fund, and detailed explanations of the legal mechanisms that govern distributions. More troubling, someone using David's name had submitted preliminary paperwork requesting early distribution of funds for a legitimate business investment, paperwork that included forged documentation about ecotech solutions' financial status and growth projections. The attempted fraud was sophisticated enough that it had initially passed cursory review, but closer examination revealed several inconsistencies that raised red flags. The business documentation included financial projections that didn't align with publicly available information about the green energy market, and the supporting materials included references to partnerships and contracts that couldn't be independently verified. Most damaging was the discovery that several of the investor testimonials included in David's application were completely fabricated. Harrison explained that the trust's existing safeguards had prevented any actual distribution of funds, but David's attempt represented a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility that could have legal consequences. The documentation suggested a level of premeditation and sophisticated planning that went beyond simple sibling rivalry or financial desperation. David had clearly been working with someone who understood trust law and financial regulations, someone who had helped him craft an approach that might have succeeded, if not for Mr. Harrison's careful attention to detail. The revelation that David had already attempted to steal from the trust fund forced me to confront the reality that my brother was willing to commit serious crimes to access money that wasn't his. This wasn't a case of poor judgment or entrepreneurial optimism gone wrong. David had deliberately planned and executed a scheme designed to defraud our family's estate, and only the trustees' diligence had prevented him from succeeding. That evening, I made the decision that would ultimately save my inheritance and expose the full extent of David's criminal activities. Using my professional knowledge of international banking regulations and offshore asset protection strategies, I began the process of legally transferring my portion of the trust fund to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The transfer required extensive documentation and careful coordination with both domestic and international financial institutions, but it was completely legal and offered protections that went far beyond what the original trust structure could provide. The offshore transfer process took 3 weeks to complete and required multiple levels of verification and compliance review. I worked with a specialized law firm that handled international asset protection for high-net-worth clients, ensuring that every aspect of the transfer met both U.S. and Cayman Islands regulatory requirements. The new account structure provided multiple layers of security, including biometric access controls, encrypted communication protocols, and legal protections that made unauthorized access virtually impossible. What made the timing particularly crucial was intelligence I had gathered about David's accelerating timeline for accessing the trust funds. Through Alex's contacts in the cybersecurity industry, I learned that David and Tyler had been researching digital fraud techniques that could potentially be used to bypass electronic security systems used by financial institutions. They had also been exploring social engineering approaches that might allow them to impersonate trust beneficiaries or legal representatives in communications with Mr. Harrison's office. The sophistication of David's planning became clear when I discovered that he had been building a comprehensive dossier on our family's financial situation, including information about our parents' assets, my personal bank accounts, and detailed analysis of the trust fund's legal structure. He had somehow gained access to our family's tax returns, insurance policies, and investment statements, creating a complete picture of our wealth that would allow him to craft convincing fraud schemes targeting multiple family members. Most disturbing was evidence that David's plans extended beyond simply accessing his own inheritance early. His research included strategies for claiming financial hardship or family emergency situations that might allow him to access my portion of the trust fund as well. He had apparently convinced himself that his business venture was so important that he was entitled to whatever family resources he needed to make it successful, regardless of legal ownership or ethical considerations. The realization that David saw our entire family's wealth as resources for his personal use prompted me to take additional protective measures beyond just moving my own inheritance offshore. I quietly alerted our parents' financial advisors about potential fraud risks and suggested enhanced security protocols for their investment accounts. I also provided Mr. Harrison with detailed information about David's previous attempts to access the trust fund, giving him the documentation needed to implement stronger verification procedures for any future distribution requests. By the time I completed the offshore transfer, my $2.8 million inheritance was safely protected in accounts that David couldn't access, couldn't trace, and couldn't manipulate through any of the schemes he was developing. The money remained legally mine and would be available when I chose to access it, but it was now completely beyond David's reach regardless of whatever fraud he might attempt. What David didn't know was that his brother's girlfriend had already outmaneuvered him using legitimate financial strategies that he couldn't counter with illegal schemes. While he was developing elaborate plans to steal money that he thought would remain in easily accessible domestic accounts, that money had quietly disappeared into a sophisticated offshore structure that offered protections he couldn't even comprehend, let alone overcome. The stage was now set for David to discover that his carefully planned theft would yield nothing but legal consequences and family destruction. I had turned his own game against him, using superior knowledge and legitimate strategies to ensure that his criminal activities would accomplish nothing except exposing his true character to our entire family. As I watched David continue to build his fraudulent business empire and make increasingly grandiose claims about his upcoming success, I knew that the confrontation was approaching rapidly. He was clearly preparing to make his move against the trust fund, convinced that he could access millions of dollars that would solve all his financial problems and validate his claims to potential investors. What he was about to discover was that sometimes the person you're trying to deceive has already anticipated your every move and taken steps to ensure that your schemes will fail spectacularly. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's criminal planning had actually protected me from a theft I might not have otherwise seen coming. His obvious preparation for fraud had prompted me to take defensive measures that I might not have considered necessary if he had been more subtle in his approach. In trying to steal from me, he had inadvertently warned me to protect myself, ensuring that his eventual failure would be even more complete than he could imagine. The weeks following my offshore transfer were filled with an almost surreal sense of anticipation. I continued my normal routine, going to work at Denver Financial Group, maintaining regular contact with family members, and keeping up the pretense that nothing had changed in my financial situation. Meanwhile, David's behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate, suggesting that whatever timeline he had established for accessing the trust funds was rapidly approaching. The first sign that David was accelerating his plans came when he invited our entire family to a formal presentation about ecotech solutions. He had rented a conference room at one of Denver's most prestigious hotels and claimed he wanted to share his business success with the people who had supported him through his entrepreneurial journey. The invitation itself was professionally printed on expensive cardstock, complete with the Ecotech Solutions logo and what appeared to be testimonials from satisfied clients and business partners. Mom was practically glowing with pride when she called to tell me about the invitation. After years of watching David struggle through failed ventures and embarrassing setbacks, she was finally seeing evidence of the success she had always believed he was capable of achieving. Dad, typically more reserved in his emotional responses, admitted that he was impressed by the professional quality of David's presentation materials and curious to learn more about the business that seemed to be thriving despite the challenging economic environment. The presentation was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, which David explained would allow him to invite potential investors and business partners along with family members. He wanted to demonstrate that Ecotech Solutions had achieved the kind of credibility and growth that attracted serious financial backing from the Denver business community. The implied message was that our family should feel honored to be included in what was clearly going to be a significant business milestone. Alex immediately recognized the presentation for what it really was, a sophisticated confidence scheme designed to convince our family that David's business was legitimate and profitable enough to justify early access to trust fund money. The timing wasn't coincidental. David was clearly building toward a formal request for early distribution of his inheritance, using the business presentation to establish credibility for whatever financial documentation he planned to submit to Mr. Harrison. The presentation itself was a masterclass in entrepreneurial theater. David had transformed the hotel conference room into something resembling a corporate boardroom, complete with professional lighting, a large screen for slide presentations, and carefully arranged seating that positioned family members alongside what appeared to be legitimate business investors. Tyler Brooks played the role of Chief Operating Officer, delivering polished presentations about market analysis and growth projections that sounded impressive to anyone who wasn't familiar with the renewable energy industry. David's presentation covered every aspect of Ecotech Solutions' supposed operations, from proprietary solar panel technology to innovative financing models that made renewable energy accessible to middle-class homeowners. He displayed charts showing steady revenue growth, testimonials from satisfied customers, and projections that positioned the company to capture a significant share of Colorado's expanding green energy market. The financial projections were particularly impressive, showing consistent profitability and rapid expansion that suggested Ecotech Solutions was well positioned for major success. What made the presentation particularly convincing was the presence of apparent business partners and investors who spoke knowledgeably about renewable energy markets and expressed enthusiasm about ecotech solutions' potential for growth. These individuals were polished, professional, and capable of discussing technical aspects of solar energy in ways that sounded authoritative to our family members. They talked about market opportunities, regulatory environments, and technological innovations with the kind of expertise that suggested legitimate involvement in the industry. However, Alex's trained eye for detecting fraud immediately identified several red flags that our parents missed entirely. The supposed investors never mentioned specific companies or professional affiliations that could be independently verified. Their technical discussions, while impressive sounding, included terminology that was slightly off from what actual renewable energy professionals would use. Most telling, their enthusiasm for ecotech solutions was expressed in generic terms that could have applied to any business venture, rather than specific praise for innovations or achievements that demonstrated real industry knowledge. During the question and answer session, I asked several pointed questions about ecotech solutions' actual operations, including details about manufacturing partnerships, customer acquisition costs, and regulatory compliance procedures. David's responses were smooth but vague, deflecting specific inquiries with references to proprietary information or competitive considerations that prevented detailed disclosure. When I pressed for concrete examples of completed installations or satisfied customers, Tyler stepped in to explain that confidentiality agreements prevented them from sharing specific client information. The most revealing moment came when Dad asked about the capital requirements for the expansion plans David had outlined. David launched into a detailed explanation of growth financing strategies that included leveraging personal assets to demonstrate commitment to potential investors. He specifically mentioned that entrepreneurs with access to family wealth had significant advantages in securing additional funding because they could show financial stability and long-term investment capability. The implication was clear: David was planning to use his trust fund inheritance as collateral or direct investment in ecotech solutions, and he wanted our family's blessing for this approach. He presented the strategy as financially sophisticated, suggesting that entrepreneurs who were willing to bet their own money on their ventures were more likely to attract serious investors and achieve significant returns. The presentation made accessing his inheritance early seem like a responsible business decision rather than an act of desperation. After the presentation, our parents were effusive in their praise for David's professional growth and business acumen. Mom kept repeating how impressed she was with the quality of his presentation and the sophistication of his business planning. Dad, who had always been skeptical of David's entrepreneurial ventures, admitted that ecotech solutions seemed fundamentally different from his previous failed businesses, more professional and more likely to succeed in a competitive market. The family dinner that followed the presentation provided David with the perfect opportunity to transition from business success to financial planning. He suggested that both he and I should begin thinking strategically about how to maximize the impact of our trust fund inheritances when they became available. He talked about the importance of deploying capital quickly in growth industries, mentioning that renewable energy investments offered both financial returns and environmental benefits that aligned with our family's values. David's pitch was sophisticated and emotionally compelling. He suggested that our grandfather would have been proud to see his legacy contributing to environmental solutions and technological innovation. He talked about the opportunity to honor our family's history of business success by using our inheritance to build something meaningful rather than simply managing it conservatively. The whole approach was designed to make early access to the trust fund seem like a tribute to our grandfather's entrepreneurial spirit rather than a desperate attempt to fund a questionable business venture. When our parents expressed enthusiasm for David's plans and suggested that early access to his inheritance might be worth exploring, I realized that David's scheme was working exactly as he had hoped. He had successfully convinced our family that ecotech solutions was a legitimate business opportunity worthy of significant investment, creating the foundation for whatever formal request he planned to submit to Mr. Harrison. That evening, Alex and I conducted our own investigation into the individuals who had participated in David's presentation. Using LinkedIn, professional databases, and industry contacts, we quickly discovered that several of the supposed investors and business partners had fabricated credentials or exaggerated their professional experience. The man who had presented himself as a renewable energy industry expert turned out to be Tyler's former roommate from Miami, with no actual experience in solar energy or business development. More disturbing was the discovery that Tyler Brooks himself had a more extensive criminal history than I had initially uncovered. Further investigation revealed that he had been involved in multiple investment scams across different states, always managing to avoid prosecution by moving locations before authorities could build strong cases against him. His pattern involved targeting family businesses and high-net-worth individuals with sophisticated presentations and fake credentials, convincing them to invest in ventures that existed only on paper. The realization that David had partnered with a career criminal to execute his scheme added urgency to our efforts to document his fraudulent activities. Alex suggested that we had a responsibility to alert law enforcement about Tyler's presence in Colorado, particularly given his history of targeting wealthy families with investment fraud. However, we needed to be careful about timing our disclosure to ensure that we captured evidence of actual criminal activity rather than just suspicious behavior. The breakthrough came when Alex's cybersecurity contacts discovered that Tyler and David had been using sophisticated digital tools to research our family's financial situation. They had apparently gained unauthorized access to personal financial records, tax documents, and even communications with Mr. Harrison's office, gathering intelligence that would allow them to craft convincing fraud schemes. The digital evidence showed a level of premeditation and criminal intent that went far beyond anything our family had suspected. Most shocking was the discovery that David had been secretly recording conversations with family members, apparently collecting information about our attitudes toward the trust fund and our likely responses to various scenarios. He had been treating our family interactions as intelligence-gathering opportunities, analyzing our emotional reactions and decision-making patterns to optimize his approach for accessing the inheritance money. The recorded conversations revealed the extent of David's manipulation and deception. In private discussions with Tyler, David expressed contempt for our parents' financial naivety and confidence that he could convince them to support early distribution of his inheritance. He discussed specific strategies for emotional manipulation, including ways to make his business venture seem like a family legacy project that would honor our grandfather's memory. Even more disturbing were David's comments about me and his plans to access my portion of the trust fund if his initial scheme succeeded. He apparently believed that once he gained access to his own inheritance, he could use that success to convince our parents and Mr. Harrison that family solidarity required making my funds available for joint investment opportunities. His plans included elaborate scenarios for manufacturing financial emergencies or business opportunities that would justify early distribution of my inheritance. The recordings also revealed that David was under significant financial pressure from his collaboration with Tyler. He had apparently promised Tyler a substantial percentage of whatever money he could access from the trust fund, and Tyler was becoming increasingly impatient about seeing returns on his investment in the Ecotech Solutions facade. David was trapped between his need to maintain the appearance of business success and his growing obligations to a criminal partner who expected concrete financial results. The evidence of David's criminal activities, combined with Tyler's history of investment fraud, created a clear case for law enforcement intervention. However, Alex advised patience, suggesting that we should allow David to make his formal attempt to access the trust fund before alerting authorities. This approach would provide irrefutable evidence of criminal intent and increase the likelihood of successful prosecution for both David and Tyler. The waiting period was agonizing. Every family interaction became an exercise in careful performance, pretending to be unaware of David's schemes while documenting evidence of his ongoing criminal activities. I had to maintain normal relationships with our parents while knowing that they were being systematically deceived by their own son. The emotional toll of keeping such significant secrets while watching our family dynamics deteriorate was exhausting. David's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic and desperate. He was clearly struggling to maintain the appearance of business success while managing the pressure from Tyler and the approaching deadline for accessing the trust fund. His mood swings became more pronounced, alternating between grandiose confidence about Ecotech Solutions' future and barely controlled anxiety about financial pressures that he couldn't discuss with anyone in our family. The stress was also affecting David's relationship with Vanessa, who had apparently been promised a lifestyle upgrade once David gained access to his inheritance. She was becoming increasingly demanding about expensive purchases and luxury experiences, apparently unaware that David's apparent wealth was entirely fabricated. Her social media posts continued to showcase an expensive lifestyle that was completely unsustainable given David's actual financial situation. The convergence of these various pressures created a volatile situation that was clearly approaching a breaking point. David needed to access the trust fund money to satisfy Tyler's demands, fund Vanessa's expectations, and maintain the illusion of business success that he had worked so hard to create. The longer he waited, the more difficult it became to sustain the multiple deceptions that his scheme required. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the confrontation that I knew was inevitable. David would soon discover that his carefully planned theft had yielded nothing because the money he intended to steal was no longer accessible to him. The offshore transfer had created an impenetrable barrier between David's criminal schemes and my inheritance, ensuring that his eventual failure would be complete and devastating. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. David had spent months planning elaborate fraud schemes to access money that had already been moved beyond his reach by the very person he was trying to deceive. His criminal activities had prompted exactly the defensive measures that would ensure his complete failure, turning his own deception against him in ways he couldn't anticipate or counter. As I watched David's increasingly desperate behavior and growing financial pressure, I knew that the moment of truth was rapidly approaching. Soon he would make his move against the trust fund, confident that his sophisticated planning and criminal partnerships would finally provide access to the wealth he felt entitled to claim. What he was about to discover was that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who has been planning several moves ahead, using legitimate strategies to defeat illegal schemes. The moment of reckoning arrived on a crisp October morning when David called Mr. Harrison's office to schedule an emergency meeting regarding his trust fund distribution. He claimed that time-sensitive business opportunities required immediate access to his inheritance, and he had all the necessary documentation to support early release of the funds. His voice carried the confident urgency of someone who believed his careful planning was about to pay off spectacularly. Harrison, who had been coordinating with me about the security measures we'd implemented, agreed to the meeting while secretly alerting both myself and the appropriate authorities about David's formal attempt to access the trust. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon, giving us time to ensure that proper documentation and witnesses would be present when David's scheme finally collapsed. The days leading up to the confrontation were surreal. David's behavior oscillated between manic confidence and barely controlled anxiety, as if some part of him sensed that his elaborate house of cards was about to tumble. He made increasingly grandiose statements about Ecotech Solutions' imminent expansion, telling our parents that major announcements were coming that would transform our family's financial future. Vanessa posted constant social media updates about upcoming luxury purchases and exotic travel plans, apparently convinced that her lifestyle was about to reach new heights of extravagance. Tyler's presence became more prominent during this period as he began inserting himself into family gatherings and business discussions with the presumption of someone who expected to become very wealthy very soon. His demeanor carried the predatory confidence of a career criminal who believed he had successfully identified and isolated his next victims. The way he looked at our family's wealth and lifestyle suggested someone who was already mentally spending money that he assumed would soon be within his reach. On Thursday evening, David called me with barely contained excitement, claiming he wanted to share some incredible news before the official announcement. His voice carried the manic energy of someone whose grandiose plans were about to be validated in ways that would prove all his critics wrong. He suggested we meet for lunch the following day after his meeting with Mr. Harrison, promising that I would be amazed by the developments he was about to set in motion. The conversation was painful to endure, knowing that David was hours away from discovering that his elaborate criminal scheme had been rendered completely pointless by protective measures he couldn't even comprehend. Part of me felt genuine sadness for the brother I had once known, the person who might have channeled his ambition and intelligence into legitimate pursuits if our family dynamics hadn't enabled his worst impulses for so many years. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to mirror the emotional weight of what was about to unfold. I arrived at Mr. Harrison's office 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, ostensibly to handle routine paperwork but actually to ensure that I would be present when David's world imploded. Alex accompanied me, his cybersecurity expertise potentially valuable if David's schemes included digital fraud elements that needed immediate technical analysis. Mr. Harrison's law office occupied 2 floors of a historic building in downtown Denver, its wood-paneled conference rooms and leather-bound legal volumes projecting exactly the kind of old-money respectability that our grandfather had valued when he first retained the firm decades earlier. The atmosphere was deliberately intimidating, designed to remind clients that serious financial matters required serious professional oversight. David arrived precisely on time, accompanied by Tyler and carrying a leather briefcase that presumably contained all the fraudulent documentation they had prepared to support his inheritance claim. He was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit that projected the image of a successful entrepreneur, his demeanor radiating the confidence of someone who believed his careful planning was about to be rewarded with millions of dollars. Tyler's presence was particularly telling, as legitimate early distribution requests typically wouldn't require the involvement of business partners or financial advisors. His role in the meeting was ostensibly to provide expert testimony about the investment opportunities that justified early access to David's inheritance, but his actual purpose was clearly to help execute whatever fraud schemes they had developed. Mr. Harrison began the meeting by explaining the legal standards that governed early distribution requests, emphasizing the fiduciary responsibilities that required careful verification of all claims and documentation. His tone was professionally neutral, giving no indication that he was already aware of the fraudulent nature of David's request or that law enforcement had been alerted about the attempted crime. David launched into his presentation with polished confidence, describing Ecotech Solutions' remarkable growth trajectory and the time-sensitive expansion opportunities that required immediate capital injection. His documentation appeared comprehensive and professional, including financial statements, market analysis reports, investor testimonials, and detailed business plans that painted a picture of a thriving renewable energy company poised for explosive growth. The presentation was sophisticated enough that it might have convinced someone who wasn't already aware of its fraudulent nature. David had clearly invested significant time and effort into creating convincing documentation, and Tyler's
Supporting commentary demonstrated familiarity with renewable energy industry terminology and market dynamics. To an observer who wasn't looking for signs of deception, the business opportunity might have seemed legitimate and worthy of substantial investment. However, Mr. Harrison's questions quickly exposed the fundamental flaws in their scheme. When he asked for independently verifiable references from Ecotech Solutions' supposed clients and business partners, David and Tyler provided contact information that led to disconnected phone numbers and non-existent businesses. Their market research included data from sources that didn't exist, and their financial projections were based on assumptions that had no basis in actual renewable energy market conditions. Most damaging was Mr. Harrison's request for verification of the supposed business partnerships and supplier relationships that formed the foundation of Ecotech Solutions' claimed competitive advantages. When he contacted the major solar panel manufacturers that David claimed as exclusive partners, they had no record of any relationship with Ecotech Solutions or any knowledge of the proprietary technologies that supposedly justified the company's optimistic growth projections. As the meeting progressed and their documentation was systematically debunked, David's confidence began to crack. Tyler attempted to deflect Mr. Harrison's questions with claims about confidentiality requirements and competitive considerations, but the attorney's persistence in demanding verifiable information gradually exposed the entirely fictional nature of their business claims. The moment of complete revelation came when Mr. Harrison announced that he had discovered David's previous fraudulent attempts to access the trust fund, including the forged documentation and fake investor testimonials that had been submitted weeks earlier. The attorney's tone remained professionally calm as he explained that these previous incidents had prompted enhanced security measures in coordination with law enforcement agencies that specialized in financial fraud. David's reaction was a mixture of shock, rage, and desperate denial. He initially claimed that any previous documentation problems were simply misunderstandings or clerical errors, insisting that his current request was completely legitimate and supported by verified business information. When this approach failed to convince Mr. Harrison, David's demeanor shifted toward aggressive intimidation, suggesting that the attorney was being unnecessarily obstructive and failing to recognize a legitimate business opportunity. Tyler's response was more calculating, as he attempted to distance himself from David's previous fraud attempts while maintaining that the current business proposal was entirely separate and legitimate. His explanations became increasingly convoluted as he tried to account for the discrepancies in their documentation without admitting to deliberate deception. The confrontation reached its climax when Mr. Harrison revealed that David's trust fund inheritance was no longer accessible through normal distribution procedures. He explained that additional security measures had been implemented in response to the previous fraud attempts, measures that required enhanced verification procedures and extended waiting periods for any distribution requests. David's initial response was confused disbelief, as he struggled to understand how his carefully planned scheme could be thwarted by bureaucratic obstacles. He demanded immediate access to his inheritance, claiming that business opportunities wouldn't wait for extended verification procedures, and that delays could cost him millions of dollars in lost investment returns. The devastating blow came when Mr. Harrison announced that my portion of the trust fund had been legally transferred to offshore accounts, making it completely inaccessible through any domestic legal procedures. He explained that this transfer had been completed weeks earlier, in response to security concerns about potential fraud attempts targeting the trust assets. David's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information: confusion, disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of hollow devastation as he realized that his months of planning had been rendered completely pointless. The money he had been scheming to steal was no longer within reach of any fraud scheme he could devise, having been protected by legitimate legal strategies that he couldn't counter or circumvent. Tyler's reaction was immediate and furious, as he realized that his investment in David's schemes had yielded nothing but legal exposure and wasted time. The career criminal had been outmaneuvered by legitimate defensive strategies, his sophisticated fraud techniques rendered useless against an opponent who had anticipated his methods and taken preemptive action. The meeting concluded with Mr. Harrison's announcement that law enforcement had been notified about the attempted fraud, and that both David and Tyler should expect to be contacted by federal investigators. He explained that the documented attempts to access the trust fund through fraudulent means constituted serious federal crimes, particularly given the interstate nature of Tyler's criminal activities and the sophisticated digital fraud techniques they had employed. As David and Tyler left the office in stunned silence, I remained behind to coordinate with Mr. Harrison about the ongoing investigation and the additional security measures that would protect our family's remaining assets. The attorney commended my proactive approach to asset protection, noting that the offshore transfer had not only safeguarded my inheritance, but had also created irrefutable evidence of David's criminal intent. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and emotionally devastating for our entire family. David's arrest came 3 days later, when federal agents executed search warrants at his apartment and Tyler's temporary residence. The evidence they seized included detailed plans for additional fraud schemes targeting our parents' assets, recorded conversations discussing strategies for emotional manipulation, and digital tools for unauthorized access to financial accounts. Our parents' reaction was a mixture of shock, denial, and profound grief as they struggled to accept that their son had been planning to defraud his own family. Mom's initial response was to blame me for somehow triggering David's criminal behavior, suggesting that my success and financial responsibility had created pressure that drove him to desperate measures. Dad's military background made him more accepting of the evidence, but he was devastated by the betrayal of trust that David's actions represented. The federal investigation revealed the full scope of David and Tyler's criminal activities, including attempts to defraud several other wealthy families in the Denver area, using similar renewable energy investment schemes. Tyler's arrest led to the discovery of an extensive network of financial fraud operations spanning multiple states, with David serving as his newest recruit in a pattern of family-based theft that had victimized dozens of high-net-worth individuals. The media coverage was extensive and humiliating for our family, with local news outlets covering the story as an example of how family dynamics could enable sophisticated financial fraud. The reporting focused on the irony that David's criminal schemes had been defeated by his intended victim's superior financial planning, turning his own deception against him in ways that ensured his complete failure. Vanessa's reaction to David's arrest was swift and ruthless, as she immediately distanced herself from him and claimed to have been unaware of his criminal activities. Her social media accounts were quickly scrubbed of any references to their relationship or the expensive lifestyle she had been documenting, and she moved back to California within weeks of the scandal breaking. The legal proceedings stretched over several months, during which the full extent of David's betrayal became clear. The evidence revealed that he had been planning to defraud not just the trust fund, but also our parents' retirement accounts and my personal assets, using whatever money he could steal to fund an increasingly grandiose lifestyle and satisfy Tyler's criminal demands. David's sentencing hearing was one of the most difficult days of my life, as I watched my brother receive a 5-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. Tyler received a longer sentence due to his extensive criminal history and leadership role in the fraud conspiracy, but the outcome provided little satisfaction given the destruction it had caused to our family relationships. The financial recovery was more successful than anyone had expected. The offshore asset protection strategies had not only safeguarded my inheritance, but had also created legal precedents that helped other fraud victims recover stolen assets. My proactive approach to financial security had prevented millions of dollars in losses and provided law enforcement with evidence that strengthened their cases against other criminals in Tyler's network. The emotional recovery was more complicated and ongoing. Our parents eventually acknowledged that their enabling of David's behavior had contributed to his criminal development, and they began working with family counselors to understand how their parenting decisions had created the dysfunctional dynamics that made David's crimes possible. The process was painful but necessary, as we worked to rebuild family relationships on healthier foundations. My relationship with Alex deepened significantly through this crisis, as his professional expertise and emotional support proved invaluable during the most challenging period of my life. His ability to recognize the warning signs of financial fraud had protected not just me but potentially dozens of other victims who might have fallen prey to David and Tyler's schemes. The professional consequences were surprisingly positive, as my handling of the fraud attempt enhanced my reputation in Denver's financial community. Colleagues and clients were impressed by the sophisticated asset protection strategies I had employed, and my experience with family-based financial fraud led to consulting opportunities with other high-net-worth individuals facing similar threats. The trust fund that our grandfather had established to provide security for his descendants had ultimately served its purpose, though in ways he could never have anticipated. The legal structures he had created, combined with modern offshore banking strategies, had protected our family's wealth from internal threats that were far more sophisticated than anything he could have imagined when he first structured the trust. David's release from prison is still several years away, and our family continues to grapple with the long-term consequences of his choices. Some relationships may never fully recover, but the experience has taught us valuable lessons about the importance of recognizing warning signs, protecting vulnerable family members, and maintaining healthy boundaries even with people we love. The offshore accounts that saved my inheritance remain active and secure, providing not just financial protection but peace of mind that comes from knowing I'm prepared for whatever future challenges might arise. The money that David tried so desperately to steal continues to grow through legitimate investments, managed by professionals who understand both the opportunities and risks of international finance. Looking back on this experience, I'm struck by how David's criminal planning actually protected me from theft I might not have otherwise anticipated. His obvious preparation for fraud prompted defensive measures that I might never have considered necessary, ensuring that his schemes would fail completely while preserving the family assets he was trying to destroy. The irony that my brother's attempt to betray me ultimately strengthened my financial security isn't lost on me. Sometimes the greatest threats come from the people closest to us, but sometimes those same threats force us to develop the wisdom and strength needed to protect ourselves and others from harm. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver felt imposing on the morning of David's sentencing, its granite columns and soaring ceilings designed to remind everyone present of the weight and authority of American justice. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, watching my brother shuffle into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled and his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow resignation of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. The months since David's arrest had transformed our entire family in ways none of us could have anticipated. What began as a scheme to steal money had evolved into a federal investigation that exposed a multi-state fraud network, destroyed long-standing family relationships, and forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, trust, and the corrosive effects of enabling destructive behavior. Tyler Brooks had been sentenced 3 weeks earlier to 12 years in federal prison, his extensive criminal history and leadership role in the conspiracy earning him the harshest penalty the court could impose. During his sentencing hearing, prosecutors revealed that Tyler's fraud network had victimized over 40 families across 7 states, stealing an estimated $15 million through elaborate investment schemes that targeted wealthy individuals with family connections that could be exploited for criminal purposes. The scope of Tyler's operation was staggering in its sophistication and cruelty. He had developed detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, identifying family dynamics that made certain individuals vulnerable to manipulation and financial exploitation. David had been recruited not just for his access to our family's wealth, but because Tyler's analysis had identified him as someone whose personality and circumstances made him an ideal accomplice for family-based fraud schemes. The FBI investigation had uncovered Tyler's recruitment methods, which involved carefully researching potential accomplices through social media, public records, and professional networks. He looked for individuals with access to family wealth, histories of financial irresponsibility, and psychological profiles that suggested susceptibility to grandiose thinking and risk-taking behavior. David had apparently fit this profile perfectly, making him an ideal candidate for recruitment into Tyler's criminal organization. What made Tyler's approach particularly insidious was his ability to convince his accomplices that they were partners in legitimate business ventures, rather than participants in criminal conspiracies. He provided them with sophisticated business plans, professional-looking documentation, and carefully constructed narratives that made fraud seem like entrepreneurial innovation. Many of his accomplices genuinely believed they were involved in cutting-edge business opportunities rather than elaborate theft schemes. David's role in this network had been more extensive than our family initially understood. The investigation revealed that he had been working with Tyler for over 18 months, during which time they had attempted to defraud several other families in addition to targeting our trust fund. David had apparently been learning Tyler's methods and developing his own expertise in financial fraud, with the ultimate goal of establishing his own criminal operation once he gained access to sufficient capital. The recorded conversations that federal agents had intercepted painted a disturbing picture of David's transformation from failed entrepreneur to willing criminal. In private discussions with Tyler, David expressed contempt for what he called passive wealth, and argued that people who inherited money without earning it deserved to lose it to individuals who were willing to take active risks for financial gain. His justifications for theft were elaborate and self-serving, portraying himself as a kind of economic vigilante who was redistributing wealth from the undeserving to those with the courage to seize opportunities. Most shocking were David's detailed plans for expanding his criminal activities once he gained access to the trust fund money. He had apparently believed that stealing from our family was just the beginning of a larger criminal enterprise that would eventually make him independently wealthy through fraud and manipulation. Tyler had promised to teach him advanced techniques for identity theft, money laundering, and international financial fraud that would allow him to operate on a much larger scale. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of David's pre-sentencing investigation revealed a complex mixture of narcissistic personality traits, financial desperation, and genuine belief that he was entitled to wealth that belonged to other people. The court-appointed psychologist noted that David showed little genuine remorse for his actions, instead focusing on his disappointment that his schemes had been discovered before he could achieve the financial success he felt he deserved. During the sentencing hearing, David's attorney attempted to portray him as a victim of Tyler's manipulation, arguing that his client had been recruited into criminal activity by a sophisticated con artist who exploited his financial desperation and entrepreneurial ambitions. The defense strategy emphasized David's lack of previous criminal history and suggested that his actions were aberrations caused by external pressure rather than reflections of his true character. However, the prosecution's evidence painted a different picture entirely. The recorded conversations, digital communications, and financial records demonstrated that David had been an enthusiastic and willing participant in criminal planning, often suggesting increasingly aggressive approaches to fraud that went beyond what Tyler had initially proposed. Rather than being manipulated into criminal activity, David had embraced it as a solution to his financial problems, and a validation of his belief that he was smarter than the legal and financial systems designed to protect people's assets. The victim impact statements provided some of the most powerful testimony during the sentencing hearing. Representatives from the families that Tyler and David had targeted described the devastating effects of financial fraud that went far beyond simple monetary losses. They talked about the destruction of family relationships, the erosion of trust between relatives, and the long-term psychological trauma that resulted from discovering that people they loved had been planning to rob them. My own victim impact statement focused on the betrayal of family trust and the way David's actions had forced me to question everything I thought I knew about our family relationships. I described the pain of realizing that my brother saw me not as a sister to love and protect, but as a target for criminal exploitation. The statement emphasized that the true damage from family-based fraud couldn't be measured in dollars, but in the permanent destruction of relationships that had taken decades to build. Our parents had chosen not to provide victim impact statements, still struggling to process their own complicated emotions about David's crimes. Mom had spent months oscillating between defending David's actions and acknowledging the evidence of his criminal behavior, unable to reconcile the son she thought she knew with the person revealed by the federal investigation. Dad's military background made him more accepting of the need for accountability, but he was devastated by what he saw as his own failure to recognize and address David's criminal development. The family therapy sessions that followed David's arrest had been both painful and necessary, forcing all of us to confront the dysfunctional dynamics that had enabled David's progression from entitled child to criminal adult. The therapist helped us understand how our parents' well-intentioned but misguided protectiveness had created an environment where David never learned to accept responsibility for his actions or develop realistic expectations about earning success through legitimate means. The sessions revealed that David's criminal behavior was the logical endpoint of decades of enabling and excuse-making that had taught him to believe that rules didn't apply to him and that he was entitled to whatever he wanted regardless of the cost to other people. Our parents' desire to protect David from the consequences of his poor choices had ultimately protected him into a life of crime that would destroy everything they had worked to build. The financial recovery process had been more complex than I initially anticipated, requiring coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international banking authorities, and forensic accountants who specialized in tracing stolen assets through sophisticated laundering schemes. The offshore accounts that had protected my inheritance became valuable tools for investigators who were trying to understand Tyler's methods and recover assets stolen from other families. My cooperation with federal authorities had been extensive and ongoing, as my financial expertise and direct experience with David's schemes made me a valuable witness in cases against other members of Tyler's criminal network. The testimony I provided helped prosecutors secure convictions against several other individuals who had been recruited into the fraud conspiracy, including a banker in Miami, who had been helping Tyler establish fake business entities for money laundering purposes. The professional consequences of my involvement in the case had been overwhelmingly positive, as my handling of the fraud attempt and cooperation with authorities enhanced my reputation in Denver's financial community. Colleagues and clients were impressed by the sophisticated asset protection strategies I had employed, and my experience with family-based financial fraud led to consulting opportunities with other high-net-worth individuals who were concerned about similar threats to their wealth. The success of the offshore asset protection strategies had also attracted attention from international financial institutions that were interested in developing similar services for American clients. I had been invited to speak at several conferences about family-based fraud prevention, sharing insights about recognizing warning signs, and implementing defensive measures before criminal schemes could succeed. The Cayman Islands banking relationships that had protected my inheritance evolved into broader business relationships that opened up international investment opportunities and advanced financial planning services. The crisis that David's criminal behavior had created had ultimately enhanced my professional development and financial security in ways that I could never have achieved through conventional career advancement. The trust fund administration had been completely restructured in response to the security breaches and fraud attempts that David's schemes had exposed. Mr. Harrison worked with cybersecurity experts and international legal specialists to implement new protocols that would prevent similar attacks on the remaining family assets, creating a more robust framework for protecting inherited wealth from both external threats and internal fraud. The enhanced security measures included biometric authentication systems, encrypted communication protocols, and distributed oversight structures that made it virtually impossible for any individual to access trust assets without multiple levels of verification and approval. The new system was so sophisticated that it became a model for other estate planning attorneys who were dealing with similar security concerns for their high-net-worth clients. David's imprisonment had provided him with time for reflection and education that he had never pursued during his years of failed business ventures and criminal planning. The federal correctional facility where he was serving his sentence offered educational programs and counseling services designed to help inmates develop legitimate job skills and address the psychological issues that had contributed to their criminal behavior. The letters that David began sending from prison showed a gradual evolution in his thinking about his actions and their consequences. Initially, his correspondence focused on complaints about prison conditions and continuing attempts to justify his criminal behavior through elaborate explanations about economic inequality and systemic unfairness. However, over time, his letters began to show signs of genuine self-reflection and acknowledgement of the harm he had caused to our family. The counseling services available in prison had helped David begin to understand the psychological factors that had contributed to his criminal development, including his inability to accept responsibility for failure and his belief that he was entitled to success regardless of effort or ethical considerations. The therapeutic process was slowly helping him develop more realistic expectations about earning legitimate success and understanding the impact of his actions on other people. However, the damage to our family relationships was so extensive that recovery would require years of continued work and might never be complete. The trust that David's actions had destroyed couldn't be rebuilt simply through apologies or expressions of remorse, particularly given the sophisticated planning and calculated cruelty that his schemes had involved. Our parents had begun their own process of recovery and self-examination, working with therapists to understand how their parenting choices had contributed to David's criminal development, and exploring ways to rebuild family relationships on healthier foundations. The process was painful and often frustrating, as they struggled to balance their continuing love for David with recognition of the serious crimes he had committed. Mom's recovery was particularly difficult, as she had to confront the reality that her protective instincts and enabling behavior had actually harmed the son she was trying to help. The therapy sessions helped her understand that truly loving David required holding him accountable for his actions, rather than making excuses or minimizing the seriousness of his crimes. Dad's military background made him more comfortable with concepts of accountability and consequences, but he was devastated by what he saw as his failure to provide proper guidance and discipline during David's formative years. The realization that his desire to be a supportive father had actually enabled criminal behavior was profoundly challenging for someone whose identity was built around protecting and serving others. The extended family had been shocked by the revelations about David's criminal activities, particularly relatives who had viewed our family as successful and stable examples of the American dream. The scandal had forced difficult conversations about family dynamics, wealth management, and the responsibility that family members have to protect each other from destructive behavior patterns. Several relatives had expressed concerns about their own financial security, wondering whether David's criminal activities might have extended to other family members, or whether Tyler's network might have targeted them for similar fraud schemes. The paranoia and suspicion that David's actions had created
extended far beyond our immediate family, affecting relationships and trust levels among dozens of relatives and family friends. The legal proceedings against Tyler's network continued to unfold, with new arrests and indictments being announced regularly as federal investigators traced the full extent of the criminal organization. My testimony in these cases provided valuable insights into the recruitment and operational methods that Tyler had used, helping prosecutors build stronger cases against other defendants. The recovery of stolen assets from Tyler's various schemes had been partially successful, with federal authorities managing to trace and freeze several $1 million that had been hidden in offshore accounts and shell companies. However, much of the stolen money had been spent on maintaining the lavish lifestyles that Tyler and his accomplices had used to project success and attract new victims. The civil litigation arising from Tyler's fraud schemes promised to continue for years as victims pursued recovery through insurance claims, asset forfeiture proceedings, and lawsuits against the financial institutions that had facilitated the criminal activities. My role as a witness and expert in these proceedings provided additional income and professional development opportunities that helped offset the emotional costs of the family crisis. The offshore banking relationships that had protected my inheritance continued to evolve and expand, providing access to international investment opportunities and sophisticated financial planning services that weren't available through domestic institutions. The crisis that David's criminal behavior had created had ultimately enhanced my financial security and professional expertise in ways that would benefit me for decades to come. The irony that my brother's attempt to steal from me had actually improved my financial situation wasn't lost on me, though it provided little comfort given the destruction of family relationships that had resulted from his criminal choices. The protective measures I had taken in response to his schemes had created opportunities and relationships that I would never have developed through conventional financial planning. Alex and I had married the previous summer in a small ceremony that reflected our desire for privacy and intimacy after the public scandal surrounding David's arrest and trial. The crisis had strengthened our relationship in profound ways, as Alex's professional expertise and emotional support had been invaluable during the most challenging period of my life. His ability to recognize the warning signs of financial fraud had protected not just me but potentially dozens of other victims who might have fallen prey to similar schemes.
Our honeymoon in Switzerland had provided an opportunity to meet with international financial advisors and explore additional asset protection strategies that could safeguard our combined wealth from future threats. The experience had been both romantic and practical, combining personal celebration with professional development that would benefit us throughout our marriage. The wedding itself had been deliberately small and private, limited to close friends and family members who had supported us through the crisis. David's absence from such an important family milestone was painful but necessary, given the legal restrictions surrounding his imprisonment and the ongoing criminal proceedings against his accomplices. The house that Alex and I purchased in Cherry Hills Village was located just a few miles from the family home where I had grown up, but it represented a completely different approach to wealth and family relationships. Our financial planning emphasized transparency, security, and legitimate investment strategies that would protect our assets without requiring deception or criminal activity. The investment portfolio that we developed together reflected lessons learned from David's criminal behavior and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even when facing financial pressure. We established clear boundaries around risk-taking and speculation, ensuring that our pursuit of financial growth would never compromise our integrity or family relationships. The trust fund that our grandfather had established continued to provide financial security for our family, though the distribution of David's portion remained complicated by his criminal conviction and the ongoing asset forfeiture proceedings related to his crimes. The legal framework that our grandfather had created had ultimately proven sophisticated enough to protect family wealth from threats that he could never have anticipated. The legacy of David's criminal behavior would continue to affect our family for years to come, but the experience had also taught valuable lessons about the importance of recognizing warning signs, implementing protective measures, and maintaining healthy boundaries even with people we love. The crisis had forced all of us to examine our assumptions about family loyalty and the difference between supporting loved ones and enabling destructive behavior. The offshore accounts that had saved my inheritance remained active and secure, providing not just financial protection but peace of mind that came from knowing I was prepared for whatever future challenges might arise. The money that David had tried so desperately to steal continued to grow through legitimate investments, managed by professionals who understood both the opportunities and risks of international finance. The criminal investigation that began with David's attempt to steal from our family trust had evolved into one of the largest financial fraud cases in Colorado history, exposing a network of criminals who had been operating across multiple states and victimizing dozens of families. The case had implications for financial security policies, estate planning strategies, and law enforcement approaches to family-based fraud that would influence professional practices for years to come. 2 years after David's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call that would reshape my understanding of our family's crisis and its wider implications. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division contacted me on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying the professional urgency that I had learned to associate with significant developments in ongoing investigations. Agent Martinez explained that new evidence had emerged linking Tyler Brooks' criminal network to an international fraud syndicate operating across 3 continents. The investigation had expanded far beyond the family-based theft schemes that had originally brought Tyler to law enforcement attention, revealing connections to money laundering operations, cryptocurrency fraud, and sophisticated identity theft rings that had been operating undetected for over a decade. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering in its complexity and reach. Tyler's operation in the United States had been just one component of a global network that specialized in targeting wealthy families through carefully researched psychological manipulation and technological exploitation. The syndicate had developed detailed databases of high-net-worth individuals, including comprehensive profiles of their family dynamics, financial vulnerabilities, and potential access points for fraud schemes. What made this revelation particularly unsettling was the discovery that our family had been under surveillance for over 3 years before Tyler's recruitment of David. The criminal organization had been systematically studying our financial activities, relationship patterns, and behavioral predictors to develop the most effective approach for accessing our wealth. David's recruitment hadn't been a random opportunity, but the culmination of extensive research and strategic planning. The surveillance techniques employed by the syndicate were far more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement had previously encountered. They had used advanced digital monitoring, social media analysis, and even physical surveillance to build comprehensive profiles of potential targets. Our family's financial activities, travel patterns, and social interactions had all been documented and analyzed to identify the optimal strategy for criminal exploitation. The digital forensics team had uncovered evidence that the criminals had been intercepting our electronic communications for months before David's involvement began. They had accessed our email accounts, monitored our online banking activities, and even infiltrated our social media accounts to gather intelligence about our relationships and decision-making patterns. The level of preparation and technological sophistication suggested resources and expertise that went far beyond typical financial fraud operations. Agent Martinez requested my assistance in understanding the specific techniques that Tyler had used to recruit and manipulate David, as this information was crucial for identifying and protecting other potential victims of similar schemes. The international investigation required detailed analysis of the psychological and financial manipulation methods that had been employed, and my direct experience with these techniques made me a valuable resource for law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. The meetings with federal investigators revealed the truly global nature of the criminal enterprise that had targeted our family. Similar fraud schemes had been executed in London, Sydney, Toronto, and Dubai, all following the same basic pattern of psychological manipulation and family-based exploitation. The syndicate had perfected their methods through decades of criminal activity, constantly refining their approaches based on successful prosecutions and failed schemes. The international cooperation required to investigate and prosecute this criminal network involved law enforcement agencies from 12 different countries, each dealing with specific components of the broader fraud conspiracy. The complexity of coordinating evidence gathering across different legal systems and jurisdictions created challenges that had never been addressed in previous financial crime investigations. My role in the expanded investigation involved traveling to several international locations to provide testimony and expert analysis about the specific methods that had been used against our family. The experience provided fascinating insights into how different cultures and legal systems approached family-based fraud, and how the same basic psychological manipulation techniques could be adapted for different social and economic environments. The trip to London was particularly revealing, as I met with families who had experienced fraud schemes that were nearly identical to what David and Tyler had attempted. The British victims described the same pattern of business presentations, fake investor networks, and elaborate documentation that had been used to justify early access to trust funds and family assets. The consistency of these methods across different countries demonstrated the systematic nature of the criminal organization's operations. The financial recovery efforts had expanded significantly as investigators traced the flow of stolen assets through international banking networks and cryptocurrency exchanges. The complexity of these transactions required specialized expertise in blockchain analysis, international banking regulations, and digital currency forensics that pushed the boundaries of what law enforcement agencies could accomplish with traditional investigative methods. The collaboration with international financial institutions had led to the development of new protocols for detecting and preventing family-based fraud schemes. Banks and investment firms were implementing enhanced verification procedures for large asset transfers, particularly those involving family trusts and inherited wealth. The case had become a catalyst for industry-wide improvements in financial security and fraud prevention. The academic interest in our case had been substantial, with researchers from several universities requesting permission to study the psychological and sociological factors that had contributed to David's criminal development. The combination of family dynamics, financial pressure, and criminal recruitment provided a unique case study for understanding how ordinary individuals could be drawn into sophisticated fraud conspiracies. The research conducted by criminologists and psychologists had identified several key factors that made individuals susceptible to recruitment by organized fraud networks. These included histories of financial failure, family relationships characterized by enabling behavior, and personality traits that made individuals vulnerable to grandiose thinking and risk-taking behavior. The findings were being used to develop screening tools and prevention programs for financial institutions and family counseling services. The educational value of our experience had led to invitations to speak at law schools, business schools, and professional conferences about family-based fraud prevention and asset protection strategies. These presentations provided opportunities to share lessons learned from our crisis while helping others recognize warning signs and implement protective measures before criminal schemes could succeed. The most emotionally challenging aspect of the expanded investigation was learning about the other families who had been victimized by the same criminal network. Meeting with parents who had lost their retirement savings, siblings who had been betrayed by their own relatives, and children who had discovered that their inheritance had been stolen provided painful perspective on the widespread damage that organized fraud could inflict on innocent families. The support groups that had formed among victims of the international fraud network provided valuable emotional resources for dealing with the long-term psychological impact of family-based financial crimes. The shared experiences of betrayal, financial loss, and relationship destruction created bonds among people who might never have met under other circumstances but who understood each other's pain in ways that outsiders could never comprehend. The insurance industry had taken particular interest in our case as the sophisticated nature of the fraud schemes raised questions about coverage obligations and risk assessment protocols. The involvement of family members in criminal conspiracies created liability issues that traditional insurance policies had never been designed to address, requiring new approaches to risk evaluation and policy coverage. The legal precedents established through the prosecution of Tyler's network had significant implications for estate planning and family trust administration. The case had demonstrated vulnerabilities in traditional trust structures that could be exploited by sophisticated criminals, leading to the development of enhanced security protocols and legal safeguards for protecting inherited wealth. The technology industry had also shown substantial interest in the digital security aspects of our case, particularly the methods that criminals had used to infiltrate family financial systems and communications networks. The cybersecurity lessons learned from the investigation were being incorporated into new products and services designed to protect high-net-worth families from similar threats. David's progress in federal prison had been mixed, with periods of apparent self-reflection alternating with episodes of resentment and blame-shifting that suggested his rehabilitation would be a long and uncertain process. The prison counseling programs had helped him begin to understand the psychological factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior, but genuine change would require sustained effort and commitment that he hadn't always demonstrated. The letters that David continued to send from prison showed gradual evolution in his thinking about responsibility and consequences, though his progress was slow and sometimes frustrating. The institutional environment provided structure and educational opportunities that he had never pursued during his years of failed business ventures, but the artificial nature of prison life made it difficult to predict how he would behave upon release. The family therapy sessions had continued sporadically, with our parents making genuine efforts to understand their role in David's criminal development while struggling with their own grief and disappointment. The process of rebuilding family relationships would likely continue for years, with uncertain prospects for complete healing given the magnitude of the betrayal and its consequences. Our parents had implemented significant changes in their approach to family financial management, working with Mr. Harrison to establish new protocols for transparency and accountability in all financial decisions. The experience had taught them valuable lessons about the difference between supporting family members and enabling destructive behavior patterns. The ripple effects of David's crimes had extended to our extended family and social circles, with relatives and friends expressing concerns about their own financial security and family relationships. The scandal had forced difficult conversations about trust, loyalty, and the responsibility that family members have to protect each other from harmful influences and destructive choices. The professional networking opportunities that had emerged from my involvement in the investigation had led to consulting relationships with law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and private security firms that specialized in protecting high-net-worth individuals from sophisticated fraud schemes. The expertise I had developed through direct experience with family-based financial crimes had become valuable in ways I could never have anticipated. The international business relationships that had developed through the offshore banking arrangements continued to provide access to investment opportunities and financial services that weren't available through domestic institutions. The crisis that David's criminal behavior had created had ultimately enhanced my financial security and professional development in ways that demonstrated the unexpected benefits of proactive asset protection strategies. Alex's cybersecurity expertise had proven invaluable not just in protecting our own assets but in helping other families implement digital security measures that could prevent similar fraud schemes. His consulting practice had expanded significantly as news of our case spread through professional networks, creating demand for specialized services that combined cybersecurity with family financial protection. The marriage that Alex and I had built during and after the crisis had been strengthened by the shared experience of protecting our family's assets and dealing with the emotional aftermath of David's betrayal. The trust and communication skills that we had developed during the investigation provided a strong foundation for our ongoing relationship and financial partnership. The children that Alex and I were planning to have would grow up in a very different family environment than the one that had produced David's criminal behavior. The lessons we had learned about healthy boundaries, accountability, and the dangers of enabling destructive patterns would guide our approach to parenting and family financial management. The estate planning documents that Alex and I had developed reflected a sophisticated understanding of the various threats that could target family wealth, including both external criminal schemes and internal family conflicts that could lead to fraud or embezzlement. The protective structures we had implemented went far beyond what most families considered necessary but provided security against threats that we now knew were more common and sophisticated than most people realized. The charitable giving that had become an important part of our financial planning reflected our desire to use the wealth that David had tried to steal for purposes that would benefit others rather than simply accumulating assets for personal consumption. The foundation that we had established focused on supporting families who had been victimized by financial fraud and helping them recover both financially and emotionally from their experiences. The trust fund that our grandfather had established continued to provide financial security for our family, though its administration had been completely transformed by the security measures and legal protections that had been implemented in response to David's criminal attempts. The enhanced safeguards that now protected the remaining assets represented a level of sophistication that our grandfather could never have imagined when he first structured the trust. The offshore banking relationships that had saved my inheritance had evolved into comprehensive international financial services that provided protection, growth opportunities, and privacy that weren't available through domestic institutions. The accounts that had been established as emergency protective measures had become permanent components of our wealth management strategy. The legacy of David's criminal behavior would continue to influence our family's approach to relationships and financial management for generations to come. The experience had taught valuable lessons about recognizing warning signs, implementing protective measures, and maintaining healthy boundaries that would benefit our children and their descendants. The criminal investigation that had begun with David's attempt to steal from our family trust had become one of the most significant international fraud cases in recent history, leading to the dismantling of a global criminal network and the recovery of tens of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The case had implications for law enforcement strategies, financial security protocols, and family dynamics that would influence professional practices and academic research for decades to come. The irony that my brother's criminal schemes had ultimately strengthened my financial security, enhanced my professional reputation, and provided valuable lessons about family relationships wasn't lost on me, though it provided little comfort given the permanent damage to our family bonds. The protective measures that I had taken in response to his threats had created opportunities and relationships that would benefit me throughout my life, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest challenges can lead to unexpected growth and success. The money that David had tried so desperately to steal remained safely protected in sophisticated international accounts, continuing to grow through legitimate investments and providing security for whatever challenges the future might bring. The trust fund that our grandfather had established to provide for his descendants had ultimately served its purpose, though in ways that none of us could have anticipated when we first learned of our inheritance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.